Do you know what? Polished turd is what comes to mind. Like, it feels like our whole kind of society and our way of life is like perched on this great big polished turd. Like, we think we're living this incredibly modern, very almost like elegant solutions to everyday problems, that kind of thing, you know? And actually, it's just a very thin veneer of what looks like incredible innovation still built on a whole pile of crap. Hey folks, it's me again, and welcome to episode 28 of If I Rule the World, the system change podcast that looks at all the things that shape the world we live in, from its natural systems to human systems, right down to the mind, body, heart, and soul stuff. You know, sometimes it's like we do this. We put all this stuff out there, these thoughts, conversations, my musings, out into the world, and then silence until, of course, I get your feedback. Like this email from Dave Hilliard in Lancashire. And Dave writes in, he says, the other weekend I watched the webcast of the Festival of Wellbeing. Yeah, that's this online fundraiser that I helped contribute to. I did a talk on it. It's for the Resurgence Trust of Satish Kumar fame. If you've not heard about it, check it out. And Dave writes, he says, I discovered your podcast, If I Rule the World, and it's brilliant. Such a breath of fresh air. Dave goes on to say, I also would like to say, I enjoy reading your monthly article in BBC Wildlife magazine. It's always the first section I turn to. I can't tell you how good that makes me feel, Dave, as I feel a close affinity with what you have to say, which is probably why I'm enjoying your podcast so much. So yeah, thanks, Dave. And not that BBC Wildlife magazine needs a plug. They do pretty well without me, but I am actually really proud of that column, that monthly column, and really grateful to the team there because they really allow me to stretch the editorial remit sometimes. So it's great to hear that column, my talks, this podcast, all of it is hitting the spot. So I'm not going to ramble on too much today, except to introduce today's guest on the podcast, Tom Greenwood of Wholegrain Digital, a company founded by a husband and wife team, Tom and Vanita Greenwood, and a company that's becoming an industry leader in an area, a field called digital sustainability. So I say it like that because it's a relatively new area of sustainability, which, as you'll hear, Wholegrain themselves fell into after wanting to get this coveted certification from B Corp, which has become the benchmark for meeting the highest standards of social and environmental responsibility. So it was while jumping through the B Corp hoops that Tom discovered that at an industry level, there still wasn't a measure, and we're talking about 7 years ago, there wasn't a measure of the environmental impact for digital technology. In fact, most people that Tom spoke to seemed to assume there simply wasn't one. Well, Tom's conscience wasn't going to let that slide, and his deep dive into looking at the environmental impact and societal impact of the internet and digital technology uncovered a jaw-dropping environmental and social justice blind spot. So what follows is an astonishing conversation full of surprises, but also incredibly wholesome, if I may say so, as Tom unpacks his disconnect to reconnect manifesto, if he were to be the ruler of the world. Yeah, a manifesto for evolved collective consciousness and a healthier relationship with digital technology.
So I started my career, got a job doing a kind of eco-design type product design job, did that for a few years, and I became really disillusioned with feeling that I'm going to spend my career trying to design eco-friendly things, but actually just designing rubbish that's going to end up in landfill. And looking back, I feel like that was a bit of a defeatist attitude, and there were lots of great opportunities I could have pursued down that line. But I was getting really interested in the digital side of things, and I had this sort of idealistic dream that, well, we could dematerialize a lot of things and just make the physical stuff go away, to solve that problem completely by digitizing it, in the belief that the digital world basically didn't physically exist, so it didn't have any environmental impact. And at the same time, in my environmental interests and sort of the type of people I was hanging out with, I was getting this impression that there was a lot of sort of anger towards corporations and this sense that like corporations are destroying the environment and they're like the source of the problem. And while I agree to some extent, I felt like it was a bit of a negative narrative that didn't have a solution being offered. And sort of down with the corporations is like, okay, that's one thing, but like what do we replace them with? Or like so I really felt like we need to figure out how do we do business in a way that is environmentally friendly. And I didn't know how to do that, and I was young and naive, and so I persuaded Vanita, my wife. Well, she wasn't my wife at the time; she is now. To start a business with me, really as an experiment, and like, okay, how can we try and run a business in a way that's socially and environmentally responsible, and how can we use digital technology, design and technology, to try and have a positive impact in the world, going down this route of sort of digital design for good rather than physical products that I was moving away from. So that was the beginning of the company that we founded called Wholegrain Digital. And over many years, we basically explored how we could try and minimize the environmental impact of the business itself, in pioneering things like remote working way before anyone knew what it was, like no-fly policy, vegetarian food policy, these sorts of things to try and like lower our environmental impact. At the same time as doing things like screening our clients on a sort of ethical criteria, so that we actually could focus our work on if we're being paid to help organizations maximize their success, whatever the success means for them, then we need to make sure that their definition of success is aligned with the world that we want to be creating. So we created sort of ethical criteria of how we screen clients, which is a challenging thing when you're sort of a young business and you don't really have any money and you don't really have any clients, and you're then having to turn people down. The one person that came through the door this month didn't meet our criteria, you know. So
yeah, talk about making life really hard for yourself.
We absolutely did. It was I mean, there were many points where we really questioned our own sanity. Somehow, I mean, I'll be honest with you, I'm not quite sure how we ever got through that period, because it was a good few years of struggling along, barely any money at all. But at some point, I think just sticking with it, we developed a reputation for our integrity, and that started to attract clients who actually did align with our ethos and wanted to work with people who they felt really understood what they were trying to do. So that's sort of really like what Wholegrain was about. But we'd gone into it with this view that digital technology is very much inert, like I said, doesn't have any environmental impact. And it was only when we're about 10 years into running the business that we woke up to the fact that this isn't true. It was when we decided for our 10th anniversary of the business that we would try and certify as a B Corp. And we went through that process sort of in year 9 of the business. And through that process, we got asked lots of interesting questions that sort of helped us think more deeply about what we're doing and what our impact is. But one of the questions was about products and how do you quantify and reduce the impact of the products that you manufacture. And of course, we're a digital agency, so we don't physically manufacture anything. But being asked the question kind of took me back to my old product design days, where I would have been able to answer that question, because that was some of the work I was doing in my first graduate job, was actually going through life cycle assessments and working out, you know, the impact of different components and so on. And I thought, hang on, this is kind of strange, because we've just assumed that digital technology doesn't have an environmental impact. And now I'm being asked this question. I realized that I don't have any evidence for this. It might be true. I hope it's true. But what's my assumption based on? We asked lots of people that we knew who were kind of environmentally minded in the digital sector, and they all told us, oh no, the internet doesn't have an environmental impact. And so we asked B Lab, what should we do? Because we got to fill in this section. And they said, oh no, you leave it blank. Everyone in your sector leaves it blank. Because the internet doesn't have an environmental impact. And I was like, okay, all right. So I left it blank the first time. We've recertified twice since, but the first time I left it blank. But it really bothered me that nobody had provided any evidence for this. It was just an assumption that everybody seemed to be making. So that basically, as soon as we finished going through the B Corp assessment process and submitting that, the next thing was straight on to like researching what is the environmental impact of the internet and digital technology. And to be honest, this was sort of 7 or 8 years ago. There wasn't a lot of information out there online at that time, but there was some. And I was really shocked to find that the internet as a whole had a carbon footprint, sort of energy consumption and carbon footprint similar to the aviation industry. And that right there was like, this is insane. Like, is that like, how is that? And that was the beginning of like really changing what we do as a company and looking at the environmental side of what we are doing ourselves rather than just our clients much more closely, trying to quantify the impact of what we're doing. We created the first carbon calculator for websites, looking at how we can reduce that impact in design and development. And then perhaps more importantly, trying to raise awareness and doing everything we can to actually get this conversation on the table within our industry. Because if we're the only people who are thinking about it, then it probably doesn't make that much difference as a small company. But if we get the whole industry thinking about it, then that could really move the needle.
A couple of things that have come up for me. One is that the way you talk about it, it sounds like this has been eons in the making, right? We're actually talking about a relatively short amount of time. I remember being a university student first year and walking into the computer sciences building and asking for an email address. And everyone sort of looked a little bit puzzled. In fact, we didn't call it email, we called it an electronic mail address. And I remember getting sort of like very randomly generated sort of numbers and figures at more randomly generated. They're like totally, like you would never remember that. And I'd love to think, that's like 30 years ago. So it's not that long ago. But in 30 years, we've gone from, an electronic mail address being issued in some tiny little dusty corner of a computer sciences department to where we are today. And so this has all happened very quickly in my mind. But the other thing that I find really interesting is that even 7 years ago, someone like you working in digital, that this was like an invisible cost of the digital revolution. So maybe for our listeners, could you describe the physical footprint? Do you have a picture of like, where are the data servers, like these massive buildings, the cables, like, how is everything networked? Where is it all housed physically in the world? Because we tend to think of the cloud as this thing up in heaven that we can just magically store all our photos and random bits of information on, but actually it goes somewhere, right?
So as you said, like we tend to think of the internet as this sort of invisible thing, and we use words like virtual to imply that it's not real, and we use the cloud to imply that it is just some vapors floating around in the sky. But actually what you've got is really three parts of the internet's basically made of three main sections. So you've got data centers, which are basically huge factories full of high-powered computers that are on 24/7. These are generally on industrial estates. You'd never see them. They're almost never marked on the outside. So you don't have like big Google logos or anything. They're like, they're pretty high security premises. So they're basically just anonymous warehouses on industrial estates. But each one of them can use the amount of energy, like a medium-sized data center can use the amount of energy as like a town like Doncaster or something. So there's just one building.
Wow, just one.
The whole building is basically just full of really high-power computers, and they have to have sort of special grid connections for the amount of power that they consume. So, and there's thousands of these scattered all over. They vary in size. You've got some really small ones. You've got a lot of sort of medium-sized ones, and then you've got what are called hyperscale data centers, which are the Google, Amazons of this world, which can be, several football fields in floor area and just, loaded up with computers. So that's the first part, is these data centers full of computers. The second part is the telecoms networks, which basically is a network that literally spans the entire planet. You've got the wired networks, so fiber optic and copper cables going to most buildings globally. I mean, you've got to think about it. I mean, we already had the telephone networks, but these have obviously had to be upgraded massively to transport that amount of data. You've got repeater stations on those networks. So at the end of your street, there's probably a little green box, and then somewhere there's a bigger green box, and then, and so on and so on. So there's a huge amount of network infrastructure, as well as obviously the mobile data networks with all of the towers and the cabling that goes with those. All of that has to be powered by electricity 24 hours a day. not to mention the actual amount of energy that goes into constructing the networks, constructing the data centers. And also, just to mention on the cables, you've also it's not just like going to the end of your street and then going up to London to a data center. It's got to go across the ocean. So you've got like huge amounts of cabling going across the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and so on. And it's kind of mind-boggling, like the cables that they lay across the ocean have to be single continuous cables. So, I mean, that's an engineering sort of like marvel in itself. And then you've got the billions of end user devices that are obviously we're using to access it every day.
So people's phones and their tablets. And
and then all the, and now obviously smart TVs and all the things that people are using commercially as well. So you've got all your couriers who are going around with their devices, logging parcel deliveries, and behind the scenes in all sorts of industries, you've got connected devices that are very sort of specialist for what they do. So those billions of devices all have their own environmental footprint, both in terms of the amount of energy they're consuming every day, but also their manufacture and then their disposal, because most of these devices don't last very long. It's not like when we were young and television might last your family like 20 years or something before it finally gives up the ghost. Nowadays, I think most people don't expect a digital device to last more than a few years. So we're using more of them, but we're also getting rid of them quicker. So that has a huge impact.
It's almost so overwhelming. So again, for me, it's the time scale within which this has happened. It's in my adult life. I love they say when we were young. I think you're a lot younger than I am, but certainly, I do remember when the idea that you would get a device like a typical iPhone, that its actual values, I don't actually know how much an iPhone is, but it's over $1,000 at least, right?
Yeah, a new iPhone's about £1,000, yeah.
And the idea that the expectation is that might see you a year and a bit until you need to upgrade it would have been insane. You'd be like, why am I paying all this money? So somehow the adoption of this technology, that now it touches every aspect of our lives, from banking to shopping to relationships, dating, entertainment, navigating. There's very little that we do that doesn't require hooking up to the internet in one way or another. So if we're to break this down into bite-sized chunks, in my mind, we've got the environmental footprint, which is energy and water and materials, etc. It touches into privacy and surveillance. There's governance, democracy, and then equality as well, digital equality, which is a really interesting, probably something we really want to dive into in quite a lot of detail. But just for you, what would you say? How do you, well, frankly, you know what? I'm trying to be really clever with this question. My question is, how the hell do you cope with all of this? I mean, how do you deal with this on your everyday? This is your job. Like, seriously, how do you break this down to be manageable and something that you can go, I can take this on?
No, you're right. It is kind of overwhelming when you look at the big scale of things. I think for me, it's been about trying to boil it down to like, what is the impact of the work we're doing and where do we have kind of leverage over things, and then just break it down into practical steps of, like I said, things you could do in the design process, things you can do in development, things we can do in terms of like guiding our clients, of like choosing, for example, where they host their websites or digital services. So which data centers are they using? And once you boil it down into those practical steps, there's obviously an education piece around getting people to understand why these things matter. But on some level, like, not everybody even needs to put that much focus on the bigger issues. If they actually know that, well, this is best practice and this will help minimize the issues, then you can actually, I found you can get a lot more traction that way, while just keeping it really, really practical and bite-sized. Yeah, so that's why we done in our business. And I mentioned the website carbon calculator for websites that we created. And that was one of those things where it's like, you look at the big issue and you're like, oh my God, it's 2% of global carbon emissions come from the internet, and that's equivalent to the aviation industry. What do I do about it when I'm a web designer or developer or whatever it might be? Or somebody working in a company or a charity who's procuring, they're trying to find somebody to design and build them a website. What do you do about it? So actually just having a simple practical tool where you can go and look at, well, what is my impact? What are the impact of my competitors? And then have an intelligent conversation around what we might be able to do to reduce it. I think those sorts of things help kind of pull you out of the overwhelm of the these giant global issues into something that's really like in your hands.
What would you say some of the biggest challenges are in terms of pivoting the way we use the internet?
Yeah, I think there's a few issues in terms of pivoting the way we use the internet. I think one of them is just the industry itself is always focused on sort of bigger, better, shinier, and there's kind of a culture around that. The digital sector promotes itself as being this sort of futuristic, forward-thinking industry, which is sort of ironic when you realize that they could have been missing the environmental conversation for a long time. But that is really the culture. So I think trying to change that culture and actually ground it in a bit of reality is one thing that I think is really important within the industry. But then I think more broadly, if we look at the people using the internet, which is all of us, then I think we actually also need to look at the fact that how this is affecting us as human beings and what our relationship to digital technology is. And there's a big role to play of that in the tech sector itself in terms of how they design addictive services, and they do that intentionally. But then we also have a role to play as well in ourselves of like how much, we have agency over our own lives, and how much do we want to be sucked into that and embrace it blindly, and how much do we want to make active choices about how we use the internet and digital technology, and when we disconnect and enjoy other parts of life, connecting with other human beings, connecting with nature, etc. So, I mean, there's so many facets to it that you can kind of get lost in every single one. But yeah, I think in terms of how we pivot, there's sort of those two levers, one within the industry culture and one just within culture of society itself, I think are really important.
So how is digital poverty experienced by somebody who is kind of locked out, if you like, of the digital world? How does that manifest in everyday life?
Yeah, so digital poverty is a sort of really interesting one that's not talked that much about. And it has this four facets to it. So there's basically, do you have access to the type of device that you need to do the things you need to do? Like some people don't have access to an internet connected device at all. So they, unless they go to like a library or something, they can't actually access the internet. But even if they have a device, do they actually have a device that's fit for purpose? And then there's speed and reliability of connection. So do they live in a place where they actually have a decent, fast, stable internet connection? Or even if they do, can they afford to pay for it in order to have that available to them? And then there's tied in with both of those things is the cost factor of, do they actually have the money to have access to the internet to do the things they need to do? But then there's also the fourth facet is the skills factor. So do they actually know how to use a smartphone and do their banking online and things like that? And that, there's a poverty aspect to that in the sense that if you've grown up in a place where you don't have access to the devices, you don't have much access to the internet, maybe your school didn't really have like great IT equipment and so on, then you may have not really the familiarity and the confidence to actually use these tools. But also that really plays out with elderly people in particular, because they haven't grown up with these things, and now they're being thrust upon them and they're being told, you need to do these things online, and they don't really know what that means. So even if they can financially afford them, they can't actually necessarily access these things because they don't know how. And then in the geographic factor as well that comes into digital poverty is like the disparity globally in terms of things like availability of devices, the speed of the internet, and the cost of data. And this is really important, I think, when we look at cost of data. But it's not just absolute cost when you look at it like, what's the dollar price of a gigabyte of mobile data, but it's the cost relative to your income. And that varies massively across the globe. So, I'll just give you an example. Liechtenstein is a tiny country on the edge of Switzerland. It's one of the richest countries in the world. They have the fastest internet in the world, average speed. It is also the cheapest internet in the world relative to local incomes because it's a very rich country. So like a typical monthly contract costs around 0.1% of monthly income for somebody in Liechtenstein, which is negligible. 0.1% of my income spent on my data. But if you look at the worst case scenarios, the Central African Republic, the average cost is 23.8% of an average person's income for a sort of a typical monthly data plan. So there's huge disparity in access to data. And like I said, a lot of the internet is developed in Western countries, by people who are digitally privileged in Western countries. So they might not necessarily be the richest people in society, but they're digitally privileged in the sense that, like, by nature of their work, they have good quality devices, they have fast internet, they probably have unlimited data, so they don't really have to think about like when they use it up. And even within developing countries, the people who are creating things for the internet would generally fit into that category within their own countries. So we tend to design the internet for the best case scenario rather than designing it for the worst case scenario. And that excludes a huge amount of people when it comes to actually their real experience of things might just be painfully slow to access, or they might be able to access it, but it burns through their data, which could have a really financial impact on them. If you load a website and it suddenly sucks 1% of your monthly income out before you've even done anything, that could be really devastating. So there's sort of a lot to consider around this sort of data poverty issue, and it's true even in Western countries where we think that, in the UK we've got pretty good internet, like in terms of global standards, but there's a huge disparity within the UK. So, for example, a lot of people run out of their data before the end of the month. I've got unlimited. I work in digital sector, so I've got unlimited broadband, but a lot of people don't, and they run out of data before the end of the month. And then basically that means that you either have no data for the last few days of every month, and then you can't access digital services, or you have to top up with money that you don't really have. And there's a shocking statistic I saw. Apparently 9% of low-income people in the UK will compromise on food and clothes in order to pay for data, because our internet, our lives are now so dependent on the internet that actually you can't function if you don't have access to the internet. So people will make compromises on things that traditionally we would have thought are way more important than data. Now it's like the balance is flipped.
I mean, that's really sobering, the thought that you have to prioritize and make choices between food, heating, and data. And up until very recently, accessing the internet wouldn't have felt or seemed like an essential, vital part of daily life, but it has become so, simply because everything that we do is now mediated through the digital medium. So, virtually everything. Obviously, being able to do what we're doing right now is great. I'm not knocking it, but there aren't many alternatives available, it seems to me. Can you kind of do a little bit of myth busting for me? Because I'm definitely becoming that sort of cohort of people that gets easily frustrated. I'm making it sound so elegant. It's never elegant. I'm usually swearing at my computer. Or, just the fact that it feels like I'm constantly having to relearn how to do the same thing, like pay a bill, right? There's like a new app that I've got to download, and then there's like a new username and a new password. And I'm sure there's some elegant solution to all of this. I've yet to find it. But what it usually leaves me feeling like, is this really better? Right? I don't mean necessarily as a user experience, but is it really more environmentally friendly? Because usually it's sold as go paperless because, you're saving the planet by not having a paper bill. But is that true? And then I guess similarly with money and transactions and digital money and online transactions, this is the myth busting bit. Is it true that it's actually less environmentally friendly to have digital money than physical money? So like £1 coin circulating in the economy uses less energy than one digital pound, if you like. Really better.
It's paperless, really better. It's a really good question, and I think it depends how you look at it. So if you look at it on a like-for-like basis, something like sending an email versus posting a letter, then the email definitely has a much lower environmental impact. So the go paperless argument on the surface does make sense. Pay your bill online instead of us posting it out to you makes a lot of sense when you compare what appears to be apples to apples, except in truth, they're not apples to apples. I'm not sure if you're familiar with a thing called the Jevons paradox, but the Jevons paradox, a guy called William Stanley Jevons, in the Industrial Revolution in England, he basically did a study and he wrote a paper where he had found that the common assumption is that when you make technology more efficient, in this case, in his generation, it was steam engines. When you make them more efficient, you reduce the actual amount of fuel consumed, or the environmental impact. So, at the time they were concerned about coal supplies in the UK, and the thought was, if we make steam engines more efficient, then we'll use less coal, and that will be good for the country. And what Jevons figured out was that actually that the opposite was true. So the paradox is that when you make the technology more efficient, it opens up new possibilities of what you can do with that technology. So then people use more of it. So if a steam engine uses less coal per unit of output of work, then instead of only using it for a few very high value things, you'll start using it for like other sort of everyday low value things that previously you couldn't afford to use a steam engine for. So you end up using steam engines for everything, and now you've got 10 times as many steam engines, and each one is much more efficient than the original ones.
God.
But now you're using a lot more coal in total because you've got so many more steam engines. And the same is true with pretty much every technology, that as we increase the energy efficiency of the technology, that's a great thing in itself. But then there's a rebound effect where we use more of it. So for example, yes, an email uses less energy than posting a letter to your friend. But especially if it's international, I can email somebody on the other side of the world with little amount of energy, but posting a letter and having it transported across the world would obviously have a much bigger impact. The trouble is that we now send trillions of emails. And so we've got this rebound effect where we're now just using huge amounts of data, which is not equivalent to what we previously did with the physical version, because sending a letter is relatively difficult, time consuming and expensive. You didn't send that many. Whereas now, for many people, their entire job is mostly sitting at a computer sending emails. It's like 8 hours a day. What do you do for a living? Well, I read and write emails. I don't think there are many people that could have said that as like, I read and write letters. I mean, that would have been maybe quite a wonderful job.
She says wistfully.
Yeah, I just write to my pen pals around the world. So it's sort of it depends on how you look at it. Digital technology is much more efficient than most physical equivalents. The same is true, like it's more efficient to stream a film on your TV than it is to drive to the cinema and watch a film in the cinema. But how often do you go to the cinema? Even before we had Netflix, and we probably went more often, you probably didn't go more than a few times a year. And you may have I don't know. Yeah. If you're kind of a movie buff, you may have done, but you're not going to be going to the cinema every day. Whereas people are streaming things like every night now. So the actual environmental impacts are not like equivalent in that sense. And then the second part of your question, remind me what the second part was. It was
the money.
Yes.
The idea that once you physically mint, whether it's a coin or paper note, it doesn't really, well, I guess my understanding of this was that it doesn't use any energy after that to circulate through the economy. It's like a physical transaction in and out of a till, in someone's wallet, in someone's pocket. But it's not using any energy to be stored. It's not using any energy to pass from one hand to another physically. And whether you can even, I guess what you said earlier about it's not really apples and apples. Like, how do you compare the two in terms of environmental footprint?
It's a really hard one to compare because you're absolutely right that digital money is basically consuming energy all the time, because even if you're not spending it, it's like a record of it has to be stored somewhere on a computer, and that computer has to be switched on permanently, even if it's a tiny amount of data. So with physical money, once you've minted it doesn't have a battery in a pound coin. It doesn't consume anything. But there was actually quite a lot of energy consumed in transporting money around to things like cash machines and banks. It's obviously it's a heavy item. So I think it's hard to know exactly how those two things balance out, but there are pros and cons either way. What I could say is that cryptocurrencies, and there are different cryptocurrencies, so if you get into the weeds, some are much better than others. But obviously Bitcoin is the most famous one. Bitcoin is hugely energy intensive to mine, and it's sort of a bizarre concept. But so Bitcoin is far more damaging to the environment than physical money. And although a lot of the cryptocurrencies that they're developing now are better than Bitcoin, the problem is that Bitcoin is the one that's really popular.
Certainly in a lot of countries, like Kenya, where I still have a lot of connections with. India, I mean, gosh, you name it, a lot of developing countries, global south countries, for whom they've sort of like almost jumped ahead with the uptake of digital technologies, and we're not as far ahead in the game in the UK. Certainly in Kenya, the adoption of M-Pesa payments. M-Pesa means money in Swahili, so M is sort of like, yeah, payments done like mobile wallet payments, I think is kind of the unbranded way of describing it. I mean, they're amazingly convenient. To a certain extent, it's safer than walking around with, wads of cash on you. I can definitely see that there are loads of advantages. And like you say, people wouldn't take it on if it wasn't working for them. But ultimately, you point out that digital inequality. Is there a way for your sector to like operate on a systemic level so that the advantages and the benefits outweigh by far any of the consequences, the unintended consequences?
There's always ways to make things better. And I think that like the mobile wallet technology, for example, is actually a good model that I'm hoping will come to the UK in a kind of more mainstream way, in the sense that you're doing direct person-to-person transfers with no cost to either person. Whereas if you pay, like here, we do nearly everything by like credit and debit card for online payments. So MasterCard and Visa, basically, and the other payment providers who facilitate that are swiping money off every transaction. And, that's billions of dollars every year basically coming out of the economy of normal people. And the more that we move to these digital payments, for everything, and even in just buying a coffee in your local coffee shop, that's actually like it's like a hidden tax. It's like 3% of every transaction is basically disappearing out of your local economy and going into like the big finance companies.
Wow.
So I think things like mobile wallets are actually good in the sense that they actually bypass, like Visa, MasterCard and so on, and actually allow people to use the technology without that hidden tax. So I do think there are ways you can design things in like that. At the same time, I think there's some things that are sort of unavoidable, because as soon as you go down the track of, we're going to digitize this, you are then necessitating people to have access to the digital world. And that means they've got to have a device and they've got to have connectivity. It's sort of an unavoidable thing in a way. I mean, you can make more affordable devices and you can make more affordable data services, but it's unlikely you're ever going to be able to make them free.
Well, and there are very few gatekeepers to that digital world as well.
Exactly.
So, And what about the other end of the supply chain, which is where does it all end up? Like if billions of devices are required, more than there are people to facilitate all of these transactions and communication, etc. What happens at the end of life of all these devices?
Yeah, so I mean, this is sort of one of the tragedies. A lot of it basically ends up getting shipped to developing countries, supposedly for recycling, but in many cases not. Globally, we produce around 57 million tons of electronic waste every year, which I like to compare that to the Eiffel Tower because it's something quite tangible that you can picture. It's about 6,000 Eiffel Towers made out of electronic waste.
Oh my gosh.
So that's like gives you some sort of tangible idea of like, this is a huge pile of toxic rubbish. Now, theoretically, I mean, there are ways of recycling things, electronics, but it's difficult and the infrastructure just isn't there. So a lot of it gets shipped abroad where a lot of it's just dumped. In Ghana, there's a place called Agbogbloshie, which became infamous for being like the biggest electronic waste dump in the world. And it's basically, like really, really poor people make a livelihood out of going there and scavenging in this like toxic piles, like huge dumps of electronic equipment, scavenging for materials that might be worth something. And a lot of what they do to get the materials is they'll literally, they'll pile up like mobile phones and computers and things and set them on fire. The plastic burns, releasing obviously huge amounts of toxic gases, terrible for their health, leaching toxins into the ground. But what they get out of it is the valuable metals at the end that didn't burn. So, the copper and so on. Agbogbloshie got demolished fairly recently by the Ghanaian government, I think because it was getting a lot of kind of global press. but then they didn't do any like real consultation around the livelihoods of these people. So actually, it's on one hand, like it's terrible that there's this waste dump, but on the other hand, people are depending on it because they've built a livelihood around it, and they come in and demolish it. But now apparently, like the actual waste problem was never solved at its root cause. The waste is still being imported by foreign countries, and it's now just more dispersed around in kind of other smaller dumps that people have set up. And weirdly, like I would have thought, I was really surprised to find out that Europe is actually the worst country for exporting electronic waste, or producing and exporting electronic waste, and that the UK is one of the worst countries in Europe apparently for it as well. So
Wow.
So it's a real problem. Like every year, apparently, like per person in the UK and Europe, we produce around 20 kilograms of electronic waste per person. And you think, well, how do I do that? Like, I don't throw away that many things that weigh 20 kilograms. My laptop doesn't weigh that much. I don't throw it away every year, but it's not all the stuff you personally throw away. A lot of this stuff is the stuff that's just baked into the infrastructure of society, like these data centers that we're using and how they're like churning over servers really quickly, the banking system and all the computers and technology they're using and how they dispose of that, as well as kind of all the kind of industrial infrastructure that is using a lot of electronic equipment that has to be disposed of. So it's actually sort of the collective impact of everything that happens behind the scenes, not just what happens in our homes.
Yeah, God. Do you know what? Polished turd is what comes to mind. Like, it feels like our whole kind of society and our way of life is like perched on this great big polished turd. Like, we think we're living this incredibly modern, very almost like elegant solutions to everyday problems, that kind of thing, And actually, it's just a very thin veneer of what looks like incredible innovation still built on a whole pile of crap, basically.
Yeah, it really is.
I mean, it's pretty wild.
Yeah. And, you see the whole thing of the tech sector is about everything being shiny and glossy and futuristic. And, I don't know if you saw the Apple advert that came out earlier this year or last year, where they sort of have a board meeting with Mother Earth and, and they report back on all these wonderful things they're doing. And, and it's,
I'm glad I missed that. I think
it's like, you just like cringeworthy. It's like, okay, but your entire business model is based upon trying to make people think they need to replace their mobile phone every year and constantly buy new laptops and virtual reality headsets and things and keep replacing them and keep people in this sort of cycle of desire without really actually addressing like what's behind that. So yeah, like they might be reporting on their carbon emissions and doing some offsetting and these sorts of things. But when it comes down to it, like, as you say, it is a bit of a polished turd where at its core, it's sort of rotten.
Yeah. And I mean, I know it feels like we're spiraling down rather rapidly into a pretty grim reality, but particularly with Apple and the calls to boycott Apple 12. I think was it 15? You see, I don't even know which number of Apple it is, the phone that we're supposed to be, getting excited about next. But whatever that is, again, that's all built on the backs of people literally crawling into the earth and pulling out these raw materials with their bare hands and, fueling some, what by all accounts is another genocide in Central African DRC. So again, like from someone sitting, in your beautiful office working in this sector in digital sustainability, and clearly someone who cares about all these things, like, how do you influence your industry? I'm just going to jump in here really quickly to do a shout out to our sponsors, Triodos Bank UK, an innovative, ethical, sustainable bank that's been in the game for almost 30 years. Triodos put their money where their mouth is. I was going to say literally, not literally, but you know what I mean. By only ever financing projects that will bring about positive change for people and planet. So Triodos are leading the way in nature-based investing and financing landscape-scale nature restoration projects, as well as social enterprises like community-owned, renewable energy, social housing, and supported employment projects. They may not be a high street bank, but they are leading the way in showing how banks and money can be a force for good. It makes me extremely proud to have Triodos Bank UK as the exclusive sponsors of If I Rule the World. You have a good grasp of the way things are run in terms of the sector you're in, and clearly outside of that as well. Yeah, what would you change? What would you ban, first of all?
Yeah. So having listened to the podcast, I knew you'd ask me to ban something. I'm not really a fan of banning things. I'd say that up front. I in my idealistic world, I would love to think that somehow we'd get to a point where humans just acted responsibly and we didn't need to ban things. But if I was going to ban something, particularly sort of more from the context of the conversation we're having here and what I do for a living, I would ban addictive design features in digital services, because this is actually like a really pervasive part of the digital sector that affects everybody. And the big tech companies in particular, they do it intentionally. They have people who are specialized in like the psychology of addiction to help them make the services more addictive. And that's it's changing the entire fabric of society, our relationship with these tools. It has a massive effect on mental health. It has a massive effect on communities in terms of like the more we get addicted to digital services, the less we actually go out and look up from our phones and connect with other human beings. There's an environmental impact to that, because the more that we're addicted to our devices, the more we are consuming data and all of the environmental impacts that go with that. And then there's also sort of, poverty aspect to that, because if you're somebody who actually has, can't afford a lot of data, for example, but you get addicted to digital services and you're burning through your money effectively, you're doing things that actually are not good for you. And then when you do need to do something that is more essential, important to your life, you can't afford to. So that would be the thing that I do. And I think it would be challenging to figure out how exactly you ban that, because you have to define what these features are. But I think the fact that there is established sort of psychological principles behind how they're doing it, I think you could basically use that as the basis for legislation to say that stop it.
So I think you'd have a lot of support with that. I genuinely do. One of the things that I also find really interesting is it's addictive. So social media platforms particularly are addictive. We all know it. We all feel it. And then there's that feeling of like, well, even if we wanted to unplug from it, it's really hard. And I'll give you an example. Like my daughter, like most teenagers, is, heavy user of Snapchat, Instagram, all that stuff. And she was having a conversation with some of her friends, and they said, well, if we all stopped using it, then we'd love to stop using Snapchat. And so there's an element. It's not just that it's addictive, but it's the networking of it that somehow makes it difficult. Even if you can overcome the addiction to social media, unplugging from it, or deciding to come off social media, it can be a very isolating experience unless you convince your network to leave with you.
Yeah. So it is a big issue. I mean, part of this is about like how they actually create the culture around it in the first place. So, Facebook kind of pioneered this, but a lot of the other apps have used similar techniques of the kind of the exclusivity of them when they launch. So they make them available only to actually a small group of people at the beginning, and they make it sort of invitation only. So it feels like an exclusive club that's super trendy and everyone wants to be a part of. So they create this culture of like, if you're not in the club, then you're somehow sort of second grade citizen.
Loser.
Yeah, you're a loser, exactly. So that is part of the whole kind of marketing ploy. But then at the same time, theoretically, from a technical point of view, it should be possible for apps to interact with each other. It should be possible for me, like with email, like, one person might have Gmail, one person might have Hotmail, but they can still talk to each other. Whereas with social media, that's not possible. And technically, there's no reason why it's not possible that I could use WhatsApp to send you a message on Signal and vice versa.
Right. Okay.
But that's not the way that they're set up. They want to keep you, closed within their platform. So yeah, I think that they could do things about it. But then I also do think that some of it is just a kind of unintended side effect, that once you've got a lot of people using one thing, then, it would be a bit like once everyone's got telephones and you decide that I think telephones are bad for society and I'm going to get rid of my telephone.
Go back to carrier pigeons.
Yeah, exactly. And then all your friends are like, well, I never talked to Tom because he doesn't have a phone. So... some of it I think is just kind of natural, the way society's evolved around these technologies, but some of it is the tech companies sort of trying to create like a closed, gated environment where everyone has to stay within their bounds.
Although I've got to say, it sounds like an introvert's paradise.
Yeah.
Like I just come off these platforms and I'll never get bothered again. And then I feel sad on a Saturday night going, why isn't anyone asking me out?
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, so you would ban addictive technologies.
Yeah.
So you get to have 3 flagship policies. I mean, to be honest, you could have more, but like I guess that sort of helps to focus the mind as rule of the world. How would you meet those out? Like your policies?
Yeah. So I'm gonna combine my first thing of banning addictive digital technologies with 3 other policies in my disconnect to reconnect manifesto. So I feel like we're losing connection with ourselves and we're losing connection with each other and with nature, in part, not entirely, but in part because we're getting more and more sucked into this digital virtual world and becoming disconnected from the real world. And of course, the digital sector is all about connecting people. But what actually, in truth, it disconnects us as much as it connects us. So the 3 things. The first thing I would do is I'd make meditation in schools, like standard, like start the day, or have it like in assembly or something to like help people learn how to connect with themselves and hear their own voice and have some quieten their mind away from all of the noise of the digital world and so on. So that'd be one thing. I'd have some sort of outdoor time policy for public services, because I think that we're not spending enough time outdoors, and I think there's huge opportunities both in schools and in healthcare, for example, to just have proactive ways of getting people outside and just spend some time in the fresh air, in the daylight, if possible, around plants and animals, rather than just inside a box with stale air and tube lights. And I think if that was sort of like priority agenda, sort of have more experiential learning outside and have rehabilitation of people from hospitals in outside spaces and things, I think that could be really powerful. And then my third one is perhaps more in terms of disconnect to reconnect. My third one is a bit more controversial. I would legalize psychedelics in a carefully managed way. But I think it's well established now that there's huge potential benefits for people in terms of their mental health, as well as the fact that there's huge potential for how it affects people positively in terms of their moral outlook on life, whether that's their relationship to other people and society, their relationship to nature, or their relationship to other non-human beings. And there'd have to be some careful thinking around how it was done. But it is crazy. We live in a world where basically you have things that could massively help individuals and help society that are classified as Class A drugs. You get like 7 years in prison for possession, at the same time that you have things that are like demonstrably far more harmful, tobacco and alcohol, for example, that are completely legal. And in the case of alcohol, actually kind of actively promoted. It's not just you're allowed to sell it, you're allowed to advertise it and glamorize it. So I think that could be a really powerful shift. There's a lot of potential there, I think, particularly in the mental health space.
See, this is something that I find really fascinating. First of all, I love the sound of all of that, like every single one of those policies. What I find interesting is I've noticed in the space of whether it's, ironically, social media channels that are promoting how you can come off social media, how you can disconnect to reconnect. I like that. It seems to me that there is an awareness in your sector and almost like a real like desire to find a better way through. Do you? I mean, I know it's hard to say, but do you think that's quite representative of people working in digital, that they're really almost more aware of the pitfalls and the harms than people outside of it?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think on balance, I think there's a lot of people who are so close to the technology, and there's a lot. Most people who work in digital technology on some level do it because they love it and they find it interesting and exciting. But I think also being close to it does make you aware of the pitfalls in various aspects, not just environmental, social, but also like the mental health, the privacy, the security, all of these things you see behind the curtain. And and realize that it's not all good. There's benefits, but there's also downsides.
So you've outlined beautifully, and again, like I would embrace all of those. The policies you would do to encourage people to reconnect, by maybe moderating use. It's not about sort of complete abstinence, but moderating your use on social media, making it possible actually to moderate your use. Maybe that's probably more accurate.
Yeah.
From a different perspective, let's say in the climate space, for example, or social justice activism, being connected with your kind of community, with other activists on social media is really helpful. But I wonder sometimes whether it can start to feel like you're doing the work when actually it's great. You are posting and liking and sharing other people's ideas and content, but is that having real traction? So from your point of view, in this like disconnect to reconnect mantra, if you like, how useful do you think digital technology is in changing the world? And could it be better? Or are there better ways outside of the digital domain?
Yeah, it's a really great question, because I think if we skip back like 10 or 15 years, I think I would have been a lot more optimistic about like the power it can have. And I think now I'm sort of a bit more nuanced in the sense that I think it does have huge power in terms of actually connecting people to campaign for things that are important to them. And bring people together who are maybe quite disparate in society. They might not necessarily geographically be together, or even from kind of social groups that would normally cross each other's paths in physical life, but they have a common interest and passion, and they can find each other on the internet, and they can connect through messaging technologies and so on. And I think that allows people to campaign for things in a way that they couldn't before, and to scale these things to actually raise a lot more awareness through the internet in ways that you just couldn't when you had to like march on the high street or hand out leaflets or something. You're limited to just the number of people you physically encounter. So I think there's still huge potential there, but I also feel like the idea that we can like petition online and that would change everything, I think, in my opinion, sort of we've seen that doesn't really work. It's not that you shouldn't petition online. It's just that I think that it becomes so easy. It's a bit like with the emails that, like, when you had to write a letter to your MP, like they receive a receive a physical letter. They don't get very many. They might take it seriously, but when you petition online, it's great. 100,000 people signed it, but your MP probably looks at it like, yeah, but they just like put their name in a box and hit submit, and they don't value it in the same way. So there's a sort of an erosion of the value of participation when it's too easy in a way. So I think there is always going to be a place for people needing to physically get out there and connect with other human beings, and whether that's meeting with like key decision makers or people of influence in society to meet with them and discuss things, or whether that's campaigning by protesting in the streets and physically getting people's attention. I think that's really important, because you can fill in a petition online, and actually not many people in the general public will even know that petition happened. Most of the people that know about it will be the people who are campaigning for that thing and decided to sign it. So I think, like, in order to kind of cross boundaries and bring other people along, we do need to get out and physically do stuff as well.
Yeah, we had a prior guest of several episodes back now who is a community organizer, and he was talking about the value and the power, actually, not just the value, the power of going door to door, knocking on people's doors and having those conversations. And I remember you saying that if it's good enough for an election, it's good enough for me. And I was like, yeah, like in this day and age, when it comes to elections and campaigning, that's what people still do, even though we've got all the technology. Just knocking on doors.
That's it. Yeah.
Hoping that they don't get slammed in your face.
Yeah. And like the Green Party, they've obviously, I mean, they're not very successful compared to the main parties, but they got, 4 MPs in the latest election. And, for a number of years, they've been running a strategy of how you actually get a small party like the Green Party that, struggles to ever win a single seat in Parliament. How do you get to the point where you could win 1 seat and now more? And a lot of it is focused around knocking on doors. You can do all the like social media marketing you want and so on. But when it comes down to it, if you've got feet on the ground, going around, talking to people face to face and discussing things with them, that has huge value in actually connecting people, not just with yourself, but with the ideas and getting their buy-in for things and finding some common ground, which you can't do if you're just like online stuff often, particularly in terms of campaigning, can seem quite one way. You're like pushing out a message, but you're not really having a conversation with people. Whereas if you go and knock on people's doors, then you're actually really engaging them in meaningful conversation.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, certainly in the States, the third party, the US Green Party as well, is kind of in a similar position at the moment. And we shall see what happens in a couple of weeks. As ruler of the world, how would you allocate the global tax pot? Who would you tax, if that even comes into it? And what would you tax and how would you allocate the revenue?
So a few things I'd do. The first is I would raise the threshold for income tax to the level that is required to actually live a like basic standard of living. Because I think it's kind of crazy that, you know, you start getting taxed at whatever it is, sort of £10,000 or something. But actually, if you can't like have a place to live, pay your bills and buy food and care for your children for that amount of money, then why are we taxing people before they've been able to pay for all the essentials? So I'd raise that threshold to the point where it's like, this is, you know, it's like the living wage. This is the amount of money that you need to actually live in this country. If you earn more than that, then we start taxing you. And at that point, it's a higher rate of tax because you've already got enough to live on. So then it's actually, now it's all kind of more discretionary income. So that would be one thing I would do in terms of who we tax and how. And I'd probably tax land, perhaps more than income. The lady who invented monopoly with two sets of rules. And one set of rule was basically to model the world for how it is now. And the other set of rules was to demonstrate that actually the reason that you win monopoly by building hotels is because when you own land, money funnels up to the top. So if you get in quick and you buy some real estate and capitalize it, then basically everyone else's money will funnel to you. And she created two sets of rules. The alternative set of rules was basically where there's a land tax, and the land tax basically takes money and distributes it to like the social good to give everybody things like railways and so on. And so, you know, I don't know if it's true, but I'm taking her word for it. She apparently did a lot of research that, you know, if you look at it, like most of the UK is owned by a very small number of people, vast amounts of land. And we think that we live in this modern world where there's like no aristocracy, and it is far, far from true. So I think something around taxing land, but maybe allowing some allowance like up to a certain point, which is like, again, the amount that you'd need to like provide for your family and like grow food. But then if you've got like an excessive amount, like more than a couple of acres or something, then that gets taxed and the money goes back to the social good.
I'd love to know like a little bit more about who invented monopoly and why, because it sounds like there's a lot more to it than maybe first meets the eye.
Yeah, so her name was Elizabeth Maggie, and she was some sort of social activist who basically disagreed with the capitalist model of American society. And so she did a lot of work to develop this game, and it was called the Landlord's Game. And came out in, I think, 1903 originally, and it didn't really gain like much popularity. Like it kind of spread among certain circles in American society that were probably kind of more social, I don't know what the right word is. I don't know, socialist inclined or socially inclined. I don't know exactly where she was sitting on that.
Leftards.
Leftards, yeah. Exactly. So it sort of became a game that got picked up as a niche thing among those. But it had these two sets of rules, and then basically some guy who came across the game in one of his social circles saw the potential in it. But he saw the potential in the capitalist set of rules that it came with. And he basically copied the game and sold it to Parker Brothers, which is obviously a huge games company. And they ended up going on to make it one of the most popular games in the world, selling millions of copies. And Elizabeth Maggie, it was only later when she took the case to Parker Brothers and said, look, you've ripped off my game. I never sold it to you.
Wow.
She did eventually get some compensation, but it was a relatively small amount of money compared to the amount of money that they made out of it. And obviously they only popularized it with the one set of rules, which is ironic because it's basically she was trying to make a point about the model of society and how it doesn't work for normal people. And then what happened is that it became really popular because half of the game reflected the reality that we all live in, and the other half of the game that was sort of dreaming about what a better world could look like somehow was less appealing. And I guess this comes back to the thing I was saying about, the state of collective consciousness, that like if on some level we've been brought up in a world that teaches us to crave personal gain and riches for ourselves and be really competitive, then we're more excited about a game where we might be able to win it all for ourselves, rather than a game where we might be able to collaborate, to share it all with everybody. It's kind of a sad reflection of things. But I don't know. I think maybe we could revive it, and maybe the time is coming where people might be more excited about the other version. But then the bigger things I'd do on a global level, I'd stop spending tax money on war. There's about $2.4 trillion a year is spent on war. And I would take the money from war to end hunger and homelessness. So I looked this up. Basically, $2.4 trillion a year spent on war. To end hunger, estimates range, depending on like which research group's done them, estimates range between $30 and $300 billion a year to end global hunger. So that's a fraction of the amount we're spending on war. And then homelessness is more expensive because you've got to build buildings. But apparently, like a low level estimate that I came across was like $1.2 trillion to provide some sort of housing for everybody who's currently homeless on Earth. Which even if that's, even if it costs more than that, $1.2 trillion is half the global spending on war. So, and you don't have to spend that every year, because once you've built the places, then it's cheaper to maintain them. Like you don't have to build new houses every year. So even if it costs you like several $1 trillion up front, you could easily pay for that out of the global war budget within a few years. You'd have enough housing for everybody. And then after that, the money can be used to maintain those, provide services to help the people who are homeless to get their lives back on track, as well as like ending world hunger. And there'd probably be loads of money left over after a few years once you've done the initial investment to actually spend on other things. So stop spending money on war, start spending money on helping people.
Bam. So as world leader, you've got all this incredible power. You've got fantastic policies, an amazing vision. What I would love to know is, have you had that insight into what has stopped us from achieving this so far? Like, what's getting in the way? What got in the way? Because obviously now you're world leader and you've fixed it all. But, we're now sort of all enjoying the fruits of your labor and thinking and policies, and can look back at sort of this terrible period in humanity where none of these things were working. And do you think we would have that sort of insight now to be able to say, these are the reasons why we didn't achieve this up until Tom Greenwood, ruler of the world, sorted it all out?
There's different ways of looking at this. On the one hand, I feel like the society we live in is a mirror of like our collective state of consciousness. So there's good things in the world, but there's also bad things in the world. And I think it's easy to look at like, it's like this big corporation doing these bad things, or it's this government doing these bad things. But actually, on some level, it's all kind of a reflection of like where we're at as a species, as humanity at this point in time. And I think so that's part of why I think it's really important that we invest in like evolving our own consciousness and our kind of moral integrity as human beings and as a society. So like prioritizing that in like how we, what we teach in schools and how we encourage people to think and reflect on things in schools. And, I mentioned psychedelics earlier as one thing, to help kind of expand and evolve our consciousness in a positive direction. I think all of these sorts of things are part of it. But then I also think there's just some sort of systemic things around the way that the systems are structured is, although it kind of emerges out of that kind of state of humanity at this point in history, the systems are designed by the people in power. It's like even democracy as we have it was designed by the aristocracy for the aristocracy in some ways. It's like, oh, look at the like even Parliament today. Look at who's in it, but look at who was in it when they first set it up. Like they weren't designing it so that, like, John from the blacksmithery could easily like get a seat in Parliament. And so it's basically, the system is designed for people with money to make more money. The financial system, similarly, I mean, we touched on this earlier, but the way the financial system is designed does funnel money up to the top. The way the land ownership structure is designed, it funnels money up to the top, as I mentioned, with the game of Monopoly. So we've got all these systems that are inherently designed to funnel money up to the top. And then what you've got is the problem that the people who want power are not the people you want to lead you. I think most people would agree that people who crave power are dangerous people in general. And actually the people who you think, oh yeah, they should be in charge of the world, they would never want to do it in a million years. Like, they're far too humble and caring, and they don't like have grand ideas of fame and status and power and wealth. They're quite happy with their humble little lives, and just helping out their neighbor and like spending quality time with their family. So there is a real problem of, like, the type of people that would want to be in these positions are the exact opposite type of people that we need to be in these positions. And I think it was Plato said that basically, if you're not careful, democracy will end up with a world ruled by demagogues, because the only people who want to be in that position and who are good, like manipulative people who can like persuade everybody, vote for me, are like unsavory characters that you don't want there. But they're very manipulative, and they've got the drive to do it because they really want to be in those positions. But then once they get there, they use them for their own self-serving purposes. So I think, on some level, we need to like elevate the collective consciousness of humanity as a whole, but at the same time we also need to make kind of fundamental changes in the structures of the systems so that they actually encourage the right types of behaviors, and encourage the right type of people to go into like key positions to work for the public good.
So with that in mind, as ruler of the world, you've got to nominate a successor, knowing that the digital revolution is gathering pace. Who would you nominate to take forward your policies and all the good work you did, but make sure that sort of carries over into this technology that essentially runs the world now?
Yeah, it's gonna be a hard one. So I'm not gonna name an individual person because, like I said, I think anybody who's probably already like in the public eye that anybody listening to this podcast would have heard of is probably too far down the track of wanting to be wanting to be in a position of power. But what I'd do is I'd craft a recruitment process that I think would tease out the right type of people. So, for example, in the Hopi Native American creation story, when they emerged into the fourth world, they, among other tribes, the tribes were all given a choice to pick an ear of corn. And the different ears of corn were of different size and quality and color and so on. And the Hopi picked the smallest, most, meek-looking ear of corn. And then the creator supposedly basically chose them as the people to carry the message for the message for humanity of how we be a good society forward, because they were the humble people who didn't seek self-gain. So I think some sort of recruitment process that follows that principle and basically is designed to basically say that, look, you're not going to get rich off this. We've put rules in place to say that you're never going to be able to get rich off it. Well, I suppose you can't avoid them getting famous, but they can't profit from it throughout their life. And they're going to have to dedicate their life to public service and sign a contract to that effect, and then somehow go like take that advert out to like everybody globally including those people who you'd never reach, who like don't have access to the internet and they live in the absolute middle of nowhere in a jungle or in, wherever it might be, in their language. Somehow, I don't know how you do this, but get the job advert out there to say, look, we're looking for
You'd have minions, it's fine.
Yeah. And then maybe we use some sort of, AI system. Well, I don't know, it might be biased, but we have to have some sort of thing for like filtering the millions of applications, and whittle it down to people who we think actually like this person genuinely wants to do it because they care about humanity. And then there's a couple more steps in my recruitment process. The second step is once we've whittled it down, we put them in an MRI scanner. So this is really interesting.
Wow.
It's been shown that if you put a psychopath in an MRI scanner, you can prove that they're a psychopath because their part of the brain that processes empathy doesn't work. So you can show them like pictures of like horrific, scary things, and nothing fires. They just don't care. But psychopaths are very, very manipulative people, and they tend to get into positions like leader of the world. Right?
Yeah, I can think of a few right now. Yeah, for sure.
Very, very charming. So that would be a filter, like that. Before we give you the job, we're going to put you in an MRI scanner and just double check that you haven't conned us and like charmed us into giving you the job, and that you're actually a caring human being. And then the third, also controversial step of my recruitment process, which I got from Graham Hancock, who's sort of archaeologist and author. His proposal is that if you want to be leader of a country or the world, before you get the job, you have to go on at least 10 ayahuasca trips.
Oh, wow.
And if you say no, well, then you can't have the job. Because the idea being that once you've been through that many, you'll have got to a point of moral integrity, connecting with yourself, connecting with nature, that you'll actually have the fullness as a human being to be able to do that sort of job for the genuine public good rather than for your self-serving interests. He also did say that once somebody's been through that process, they would probably opt out and and say, nah, I'm happy to just be at home and grow some vegetables. And I don't want to be leader of the world. But, there's got to be somebody out there who would look at it the other way and say, well, actually, no, it's not necessarily what I want to do, but I'm going to do it through a sense of duty. And I think that's what we need in a world leader, is someone who's doing it as
for
genuine,
the right reasons.
Yeah, for the right reasons, as a duty rather than for greed.
Wow, that would be something. In fact, you've just reminded me that there is a creative filmmaker, and I came across, I wish I could remember his name right now, who's produced 2 or 3 AI assisted films where Musk, and then another one where Trump, and one with Benjamin Netanyahu as well, all going through a kind of spiritual awakening. 2 of them, Elon Musk and Donald Trump, on ayahuasca trips, and Bibi Netanyahu with this kind of, vision that he receives from God. And it's like really wild. And it's very cleverly done because the way their faces change and the kind of the muscles soften as they kind of go through their healing. It's pretty cool. I don't know if you've come across it. I'm going to have to find that. But that would be an incredible election cycle. Certainly, it would make it would make it a really different experience for those of us, the minions that get to vote. That's brilliant. So once you've achieved all these things, like, where do you retire? Where's your happy place?
I would retire to right here where I am. So I live in the New Forest in the south of England, and it really is sort of my spiritual home. I was born here, but I didn't grow up here, and my parents moved away when I was 2, and then I don't know, something in me drew me back, and when I'm here, I just feel completely at home and content, like this is where I'm meant to be. And I think it's one of the most beautiful places in the UK, with our wild animals and big rolling landscapes and the sea on our doorstep and more sunshine than most places in the UK. So it's like, it ticks all the boxes. I'm like, why would I want to leave here?
Just a massive thank you to Tom for that conversation. We started, of course, touching on just some of the ways that the digital cyber world impacts our environment, our lives, our relationships with all this tech. It made me wonder, can we set the terms of this relationship? Do we have a say on whether the Earth gets wrapped in cables and trussed like a roast chicken or turkey or whatever? And by the way, check out the show notes for loads of links and information of mentions in this conversation, but also for a world map which shows over 420 submarine cables that we're allowed to know about, which run a total length of 700,000 miles, spanning oceans, stretching around the world. I mean, do we get to have a say in that? Obviously not, because it's already happened. Don't get me wrong, this tech is how I make a living. It's how I get to do this podcast, and I'm not knocking it. But it seems that it comes at a cost, and it would just be nice if we could live in a world where, just like with big tobacco and big oil and big pharma and big ag and big fashion, fast fashion, all that stuff, the list is endless. It would be nice if we didn't have to go sector by sector, new shiny innovation by new shiny innovation, having to pull back the curtain to reveal the crap that underpins it all. Crap that somehow always seems not to be good for us, for people, or for planet. Now, wouldn't that be nice if governments just did their jobs, serve the people, and regulate these freaking industries, right? Let me know what you think. What are your takeaways from this episode? You can comment directly on Spotify, or you can email the show on podcast@gillianburkevoice.com. Don't forget to follow, like, and most importantly, share this episode with anyone you think who needs to hear this. As ever, a huge thank you to the team, editor Jake, producer Sam, and to exclusive sponsors Triodos Bank for making this conversation possible. I really hoped you enjoyed today's episode as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. And after all the talking, the thinking, and heavy lifting, don't forget, take a moment, take a breath, and as you do, ask yourself, if you rule the world, what would you do? Thanks for listening.